Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. We're going to be looking at God on Trial, Part 3 today. Now, just to get you caught back up again, remember, Jesus started his trial. He was arrested a few hours ago. He went to Annas. He went to Caiaphas, who was the high priest. He went to Pontius Pilate, who was the governor of Judea, appointed by Rome. And then at some point, and we're not going to see this in John's gospel, he gets sent to King Herod, who was a Roman appointed king over Israel. And Herod wanted nothing to do with him. So he sends him back to Pilate, which is what we're going to be reading now in John chapter 19, verses 1 through 16. Now, the Gospels do not get into full detail about what I'm going to be reading now. And I just want to get a picture in your mind. If you've seen the movie The Passion of the Christ, you'll understand exactly what I'm going to be talking about here. In the first couple of verses, we're going to read that Jesus was flogged, he was scourged. And what that was he was tortured by Pilate's soldiers. And part of that torture was that they would use whips and chains on him, on his back to beat him. They would use long, thin sticks of wood they would whip on him, and it would create holes in his back. And they also had these other kinds of whip tools that it was a long stick, and at the end of the stick was maybe 4 or 5, 6 or 7 strips of leather, and in these strips of leather were embedded stones and gravel, rocks, other metal. All right, they would embed it, and what they would do is they whip the person's back, and it would basically pull their skin off. And a lot of people who were whipped this way died. Some almost died, and others went stark raving crazy. And that's what Jesus is going through right now. And all of this that he's going through is for this explicit purpose of humiliating him. And they wanted to humiliate him, and we're going to read this now in chapter 19, verses 1 to 16. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here's your man." As soon as the chief priests and the other officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." So, however long this took, Jesus was beaten. He was tortured by the soldiers, basically to the point where he was going to lose his life. It literally had the life beaten out of him. And Pilate showed him to the crowd, hoping that the crowd would say, "Okay, fine, that's enough, let him go, we're done." But they didn't. They saw Jesus there, and instead of having compassion and saying, "Okay, yeah, this is enough, he's learned his lesson," they're continuing on to crucify him. So Pilate says in verse 6, he says, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis to charge him at all." Then the Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." Now, when Pilate heard this, something clicked in his head. Now, remember, Pilate has had a relationship with Jesus over the last few hours, and throughout Jesus' ministry, he knew who he was. And if you remember back in chapter 18, Jesus said that he had a kingdom, but his kingdom was not of this earth, that his kingdom did not originate here, that his kingdom was from heaven. So when Pilate heard this, when he heard the Jews tell him that he claimed to be God, something went off on him. He says, "You know what? There's something about this guy I need to investigate further. I need to see exactly who he is." So Pilate goes into him in verse 8, and he says, when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Pilate knew, and he wanted to know. He was looking to see, who is Jesus? I've got a feeling about this guy. I've tortured many men before him, and most of them have cried and begged for their lives and even made up stories as to tell me who they were. But this guy here is standing before me. He has something different about him. There's a calmness about him. There's a strength about him. I think he may be who he's saying he is. And that's what Pilate might be thinking at this point. Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Jesus is telling Pilate, Pilate says, listen, I've got the power. I'm the one who can either let you go or kill you. And Jesus says, you have no power unless it is given to you from above. And Jesus knew this. Jesus knew he had to go through this. He knew all of this had to take place. And he knew where that power came from because it was preordained from Jesus while he was in heaven that this is what he must go through. And Pilate was going to be the one to do it. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. He went over and over again, tried to do this, tried to tell them, no, it's not going to happen. But the Jewish leaders kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be the king opposes Caesar. This was important to Pilate because Pilate was appointed to the governorship over Judea. And it was basically a lowly place. It was probably the furthest place away from Rome that you could get. And Tiberius, who was the Caesar at the time, sent him there. But Tiberius kind of kept him a little bit close, only because Pilate was married to Tiberius's granddaughter. So Pilate's here thinking, all right, you know what, I've got a friend here. But the Jews are throwing their trump card at him, saying, no, listen, if you don't crucify him, you're no friend to Caesar. And Pilate realized that. So what Pilate did was he said, okay, you know what? My supposed friendship with Caesar that I think I have is more important than doing the right thing by letting you go. So, you know what? I'm going to crucify you. So when Jesus heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat him down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about noon. Here's your king, Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priest answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. Pilate tried and tried again to make the beating be enough. But the Jewish leaders didn't want to hear anything about it. They wanted him crucified, and they were dead set that they were going to get that done. Pilate finally had to give up and say, listen, there's nothing more I can do about this. They pulled the trump card. They're going to rat me out to Caesar, and that's the last thing I want. Because you know what? Married to his granddaughter or not, if this got back to Caesar, Caesar was going to kill Pilate. There's no question about it. So Pilate viewed his friendship with Pilate and his life, friendship with Caesar and his life more important than doing the right thing by setting Jesus free. Now, what we have to see in this is that Jesus knew all this was going to happen. He was preordained. God the Father told him the plan. Jesus came to earth to fulfill the plan, and Jesus went through all this knowing two things. One, he was going to be going back to heaven. He knew that, and he was on his way, and he was ready to go. But he also knew that going through all of this was going to satisfy God the Father's anger against humanity. That this was enough, that God was shedding his own blood so that a new covenant could be written, so that there will be a new promise to man, and so that everyone who trusts in him, that accepts, this is the gift of salvation coming up. We're going to see it on the cross, we're going to see it in the resurrection, that anyone, it doesn't matter who you are, if you accept this, if you trust it, if you believe that God sacrificed himself so that you could be with him, you will be with him. That's the whole plan right here. All right, so next week we're going to be looking at the crucifixion of Jesus. And I think, another chapter or two, and we're going to be done with John. So have yourself a great week.